There are books that change the way we think. And then there are books that strip away our illusions entirely, leaving us naked before the truth of our own nature. Stanley Milgram's The Perils of Obedience is one of those books. It does not speak in abstractions or speculate from the ivory tower. It grabs the reader by the moral collar and pulls them into a stark, clinical, and yet profoundly disturbing revelation, that ordinary people, under the subtle influence of authority, can become instruments of cruelty, not because they are evil, but because they are obedient. Milgram's work was born in the long, haunted shadow of the Holocaust. The post-war world had watched in horror as bureaucrats and guards, generals and secretaries, stood before international tribunals and offered the same defense: "I was just following orders." This phrase, so horrifyingly casual, demanded investigation. Was it merely an excuse? Or was there something darker, something systemic, psychological, and deeply human, at work beneath it? Milgram's answer was revolutionary, and terrifying in its simplicity. He constructed an experiment not to test intelligence or ideology, but moral autonomy under pressure. Participants, believing they were part of a memory study, were asked to administer electric shocks to another person. As the shocks increased and the victim's cries turned to silence, the subject was met not with violence or threats, but with the calm, firm reassurance of a man in a white lab coat saying, "Please continue." And they did. The majority obeyed. They obeyed even when it meant inflicting pain, even when it meant violating their conscience, even when they feared they might be killing someone. They obeyed because the structure around them made obedience feel like the right thing to do. What Milgram uncovered was not just the mechanics of a social experiment, it was the architecture of atrocity. He revealed that the line between good and evil is not etched into ideology or nation, but drawn in sand within the heart of each individual. And when authority speaks, that line can vanish. This book is not merely about an experiment. It is a profound reflection on civilization itself, on the systems we build, the roles we inhabit, and the frightening ease with which personal responsibility can be outsourced to faceless institutions. Milgram's findings remain urgently relevant. In a world ruled by hierarchies, military, political, corporate, scientific, the temptation to surrender judgment to authority has only grown. The question is no longer whether people can obey immoral commands. We know they can. The question is whether we are willing to teach, protect, and demand the kind of inner strength required to disobey when obedience becomes a crime. The Perils of Obedience is not a comfortable read. But it is a necessary one. Because the most terrifying revelation of the book is not that others obeyed. It is that you might, too. Chapter 1, The Question That Shatters Our Innocence. The book opens not with an answer, but with a wound, an unhealed, moral rupture that still bleeds through the fabric of modern history. The question is primal and searing: how do ordinary people, people with jobs, families, friends, and a conscience, become the silent hands of tyranny? Stanley Milgram writes not as an accuser, but as a mirror. His work was not fueled by hatred or vengeance, but by disbelief, by the disturbing consistency of one phrase echoed through Nazi courtrooms: "I was just following orders." The problem was not the presence of monstrous evil, but its absence. What disturbed Milgram, and what must disturb us, is that the architects and participants of the Holocaust were not all bloodthirsty fanatics. Many were secretaries, accountants, railway officials. Men and women who would have blended seamlessly into any society, any neighborhood. Their most dangerous trait was not cruelty. It was compliance. Milgram does not begin his inquiry by assuming that evil is rare. He assumes, more disturbingly, that obedience is common, that the machinery of violence does not require fanatics, only willing subordinates. This chapter is not simply an introduction, it is an initiation. It rips away the fantasy that evil comes from somewhere else, from others. Instead, Milgram dares us to ask, what if the greatest atrocities in history were committed by people who looked exactly like us? Chapter 2, The setting of the experiment. The location was Yale University, a symbol of intellectual rigor, tradition, and credibility. The architecture was modern, unthreatening. The corridors echoed with the footsteps of future scientists, doctors, and leaders. It was not a dungeon. It was not a war zone. It was a trusted institution. This context was no accident. It was part of the experiment. Volunteers, ordinary men from various professions and backgrounds, were told they would participate in a study about memory and learning. Their role was to act as the teacher. They would test the memory of a second man, the learner, and administer electric shocks when the learner made errors. What the subject did not know, the learner was not a real participant, but an actor. The shocks were fake. The suffering, however, was not the learners, but the teachers. Each error was met with an increase in voltage. The switchboard had clear, labeled intervals: 15 volts, slight shock 150 volts, moderate shock 375 volts, danger, severe shock 450 volts, 30. As the switches were flipped, the learner began to cry out. Bang on the wall. Plead to stop. Then grow silent. Lifeless. And all the while, the man in the lab coat, the experimenter, stood beside the teacher and calmly instructed, "Please continue." This was not just an experiment. It was a moral trap, elegant, banal, and terrifyingly real. It was designed to reproduce, in miniature, the machinery of obedience that fuels bureaucracies, armies, and systems of control. And it succeeded. Chapter 3, The Unexpected Monsters Among Us. The results shocked even Milgram. He had assumed that only a minority, the aggressive, the unstable, would go to the full 450 volts. But reality was far more disturbing. Most people obeyed. Men who described themselves as kind, peaceful, moral, who cringed at the learner's pain, still pushed the final switch. Some laughed nervously. Others cried. One man dug his nails into his skin until he bled. Yet when prompted, they continued. Why? Because the burden of choice had been lifted. Because someone else, the experimenter, had assumed the responsibility. The participants were no longer acting as moral individuals. They had entered what Milgram calls the agentic state, a psychological condition where the subject no longer sees themselves as personally responsible for their actions. They became instruments. Not monsters. Not maniacs. Instruments. And instruments, once engaged, do not question the music they play. Milgram's horror was this: evil did not need hatred. It only needed obedience. Evil did not always storm into history waving flags. Sometimes, it wore a calm smile and said, "We're conducting a study." Chapter 4, The Slippery Slope of Evil. What makes Milgram's findings so chilling is not the end result, the maximum shock, but the path that led there. No one walked in intending to cause harm. But the structure of the experiment was built like a staircase. Each shock level was just 15 volts more than the last. Each decision seemed only slightly worse than the one before. The participant would think, "I've already gone this far. One more switch won't make a difference." He agreed to this. "I don't want to be rude." And so they climbed, step by incremental step, into moral catastrophe. This is how real-world horrors happen. Not all at once, but by degrees. The clerk files one more deportation form. The soldier follows one more ambiguous order. The citizen stays silent one more time. Milgram shows that morality does not break suddenly. It erodes silently, logically, and with good intentions. The most dangerous evils are not committed in fury. They are committed by people who tell themselves, "I'm just doing my part." Chapter 5, The Voice of Authority. Milgram's most subtle, and disturbing, insight is this: authority does not need to scream to control you. It only needs to exist. The experimenter's voice is not harsh. He never yells. He doesn't threaten. His power lies in his calm, his certainty, and his uniform. When subjects hesitate, he offers no reasoning. No philosophical argument. Just 4 quiet prods: "Please continue." The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. And these 4 sentences, spoken gently, are more powerful than violence. Because what he really says is, "I am the structure. I am the rule. You are not responsible. Obey." This is how bureaucratic evil functions. In the real world, it looks like the government official who signs off on surveillance. The nurse who gives the injection she's uncomfortable with. The employee who follows unethical corporate orders because head office said so. They do not disobey. Not because they're evil, but because authority makes disobedience feel like betrayal. Milgram warns us, the real danger is not in disobedience. It is in the ease of obedience, in the emotional relief of letting someone else take over your moral decisions. And so the world becomes filled not with tyrants, but with followers. Chapter 6, The Collapse of Conscience. Here lies the core of the tragedy. The subject, the teacher, knows what he's doing is wrong. He's not ignorant. He hears the learner scream. He asks if the person is okay. His hands tremble. His voice shakes. He turns to the experimenter in visible anguish. And still, he obeys. This is not a failure of reason. It is the death of trust in oneself. The subject has learned, over a lifetime, to prioritize authority over instinct, rules over empathy, duty over doubt. He has been taught that the voice outside him, calm, educated, certain, is more reliable than the one within. This, Milgram shows us, is the psychological fracture at the heart of every atrocity. Not hatred. Not sadism. But moral outsourcing. The subject no longer sees himself as a moral actor. He sees himself as part of a system. A system where obedience becomes a virtue, and responsibility becomes someone else's job. This is how genocides happen. This is how torture becomes policy. This is how whistleblowers remain silent. This is how soldiers justify the murder of civilians. Not with rage, but with compliance. When conscience collapses under the weight of authority, the soul doesn't scream. It whispers, "I have no choice." And that whisper, more than any shout, is what makes evil possible. Chapter 7, Those who said no but not everyone obeyed. About 1/3 of Milgram's participants refused to go on. Some stopped at 150 volts, others at 210, some later. But they stopped. They turned their bodies away from the switches. They argued. They raised their voices. One man shouted, "I'll hurt the experimenter if I have to." Milgram does not exaggerate their heroism. He simply records it, as something precious, and rare. What made them different? It wasn't higher education. It wasn't political ideology. It wasn't a specific upbringing. It was something deeper. Something harder to quantify, a moral boundary that could not be crossed, even when pushed. These people had a living conscience. One that would not be silenced by protocol. They had internalized a core truth: no system, no title, no instruction can replace my judgment of right and wrong. But they paid for it. They faced social discomfort. They worried they'd ruin the experiment. Some left shaking with guilt. Why? Because to resist authority often feels like betrayal, even when it's the right thing to do. And yet, they walked away intact. In a world where obedience is praised and rewarded, Milgram reminds us that the true protectors of human dignity are those willing to say, "I will not continue." Chapter 8, Repetition across cultures and contexts. What if this was just an American phenomenon? A quirk of Western psychology? A relic of Cold War deference to science? Milgram tested that. He repeated the experiment across different environments, with women as subjects. In different institutional settings. Across different countries. The results remained consistent, and chilling. Obedience was not tied to nationality. Or gender. Or class. It was universal. From the United States to Germany, from Australia to the Netherlands, the percentage of participants willing to administer maximum shocks remained startlingly high. Milgram's conclusion is devastating in its simplicity: the problem is not cultural. The problem is human. The willingness to obey, to suspend judgment, to defer, to follow, is baked into our psychology. It's what makes societies functional. But when hijacked, it becomes what makes them deadly. We can no longer say, "That would never happen here." Because it already has. And it can, anywhere. Chapter 9, The Myth of the Monster. One of Milgram's most profound contributions is his destruction of the monster myth. When we think of evil, we like to think of it as something other. Something foreign. Something ugly and distant, easy to recognize and easy to hate. But Milgram shows us a different, more terrifying reality. Evil can have good posture. Evil can wear a tie. Evil can smile and make polite conversation during a lunch break. The bureaucrats who deported Jews to their deaths were not serial killers. They were accountants, ticket clerks, municipal planners. The soldiers who executed civilians were not demons, they were fathers, young men trying to follow orders. Milgram forces us to confront the unbearable truth: the line between good and evil does not run between people. It runs through every human heart. The most horrifying discovery of the 20th century was not the existence of evil, but its normality. Its banality. Its terrifying ability to inhabit ordinary roles and mundane rituals. What separates the executioner from the neighbor, Milgram suggests, is not character, but context. And that context, authority, can transform the average into the unthinkable. Chapter 10, The Ethics of the Experiment. Milgram anticipated, and received, A wave of ethical criticism. Many accused him of deceiving and traumatizing his participants. After all, the emotional toll was real. Some subjects wept. Others shook uncontrollably. A few left feeling deeply ashamed. So was it worth it? Milgram answers with a measured but firm yes. Because the lesson his subjects learned, and that we learn through them, is more valuable than comfort. It is the knowledge of our own vulnerability. In follow-up interviews, most participants said they were grateful to have taken part. Many described it as a turning point, a confrontation with themselves they never would have chosen, but never forgot. Milgram believed the ethical discomfort of the experiment was a mirror of the deeper discomfort we must face about human nature itself. The real ethical failure, he argued, would be to ignore the findings. To pretend we are immune. To cling to the illusion that we would never do such a thing. Milgram doesn't call for fear. He calls for vigilance. Not just in others, but in ourselves. Because evil isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a quiet instruction, and your own hand reaching for the switch. Chapter 11, The Banality of Evil, Bureaucratized Atrocity. In this chapter, Milgram aligns his findings with the chilling insights of political theorist Hannah Arendt, who coined the phrase the banality of evil while covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was not a raving ideologue. He did not murder with his own hands. He was a bureaucrat, efficient, meticulous, passionless. His job was to coordinate train schedules that transported millions to their deaths. His defense? He was simply executing orders, fulfilling a role, serving the state. I was doing my duty. Milgram recognized this not as an anomaly, but as a mirror of what he observed in the laboratory, a system where obedience depersonalizes, compartmentalizes, and ultimately neutralizes conscience. When evil is embedded within institutions, when policies and procedures disguise suffering as logistics, no one feels responsible. Everyone becomes a cog in a wheel that no one owns. And atrocities occur not through malice, but through paperwork, silence, and standard operating procedures. The man signs a form. The assistant stamps it. The officer executes the order. No single step feels like murder. But taken together, they become genocide. Milgram's warning is clear: systems are dangerous not when they are evil, but when they are mindless. When obedience is praised above judgment. When titles replace ethics. When procedures silence personal responsibility. This is how evil enters history, not as a monster, but as a meeting agenda. Chapter 12, Real-World Reflections. Milgram was not content to let his findings sit in the lab. He wanted us to see them everywhere. And once you understand his framework, you do. The My Lai Massacre, Vietnam, 1968, American soldiers, under Lieutenant Calley's command, slaughtered hundreds of civilians, women, children, the elderly. Why? Because they were ordered to. Many said they felt it was wrong. But they obeyed. Corporate misconduct, executives approve toxic products. Middle managers enforce quotas that exploit workers. Salespeople hide information from customers. The system rewards obedience, not questions. Medical errors. Studies have shown that nurses will administer dangerous dosages of medication if a doctor tells them to, even when it violates protocol, simply because the title carries weight. Milgram points out that obedience often masquerades as professionalism. We don't call it submission, we call it doing your job. And in doing so, we turn moral decisions into operational compliance. He challenges us: how often do we act against our better judgment, not because we want to, but because someone told us to? Most acts of obedience are not dramatic. They are quiet, passive, unseen. Saying nothing when your boss bullies a colleague. Enforcing a rule you know is unjust. Turning away because that's not your department. The face of obedience is not violence. It's silence. Chapter 13, Dismantling the Illusion of Autonomy. Here Milgram shatters a myth central to our modern identity, the belief that we are independent moral agents. We like to imagine ourselves as rational individuals who make conscious choices. But Milgram argues that most people underestimate the extent to which their actions are shaped by social context, authority, and structure. From childhood, we are trained to follow parents, teachers, bosses, police, doctors, presidents, and priests. We're taught that obedience is not only safe, but virtuous. That questioning authority is rebellious, rude, or dangerous. But this blind training comes at a cost. Milgram shows us that when obedience becomes habitual, we stop examining what we obey. And when we stop examining, we lose our moral compass. We become moral automatons, walking, talking justifications for things we know are wrong. And the scariest part? The person carrying out atrocities often feels less guilt, because they no longer feel like they're choosing. In reality, they are choosing, they've just lost the ability to see it. Milgram urges us to reclaim our autonomy, not by rejecting all authority, but by developing the courage to question it. The greatest danger is not authority itself. It's authority that is never challenged. Chapter 14, Education as the Antidote. After exposing the darkness of obedience, Milgram doesn't leave us in despair. He offers something else, hope, but not passive hope. He believes that if obedience is learned, then so is disobedience. And therefore, the antidote to blind obedience is not more rules, but more ethical education. From the classroom to the workplace, we must begin to teach critical thinking over conformity, responsibility over role-playing, empathy over efficiency, moral courage over silent professionalism. Milgram proposes a shift in our cultural framework. Obedience must no longer be the highest good. Instead, we must elevate ethical resistance. Children should learn that respecting authority is not the same as surrendering to it. That rules must be tested against conscience. That speaking up is sometimes the greatest civic act. He argues that ethical courage is not instinctive, it is trained, nurtured, and protected by culture. In a world where systems often suppress individual conscience, the future depends on raising people who can say no, when no must be said. Chapter 15, The Final Warning. Milgram closes with a message that resonates like a bell tolling across history. The danger of obedience is not a relic of the past. It is eternal. Wherever there is hierarchy, wherever there is power, wherever there are uniforms, job descriptions, and standard procedures, the temptation to obey without thinking is always present. Milgram does not say resist all authority. He says, resist unjust authority. Resist without hatred. Resist with awareness. Resist with your full humanity intact. Because the world does not unravel when someone says yes. It begins to unravel when no one says no. That's the quiet beginning of every catastrophe, not a scream, but a shrug. Not a gunshot, but a button pushed. Milgram reminds us that our survival, as a moral civilization, depends not on heroes, but on ordinary people, the kind who sit in quiet rooms, facing a decision, and choose not to flip the switch. Milgram's The Perils of Obedience is not just a psychological text, it is a moral test. It doesn't ask whether others will obey. It asks whether you will. When the time comes, in war, at work, in silence, in secret, will you follow orders? Or will you pause and listen to your conscience? That's the only question that matters.